With market conditions looking as bleak as ever, you might think $600 or maybe more would not be enough to build a gaming desktop, let alone even a graphics card at MSRP prices. And while you could make the argument that AMD's APUs could be a set-in temporary option, well, those aren't even out for the public to buy, generally speaking, or they're extremely expensive, and finding a pre-built system to snatch the APU from is also a pricey affair. Impressively though, throughout this time, HP has had a system at Walmart for sale to meet that budget, or at least if it's available at the same price. The name sucks, being the TG01-0023w. However, if its hardware is usable, and you're not in the market to scalp, and if there aren't too many compromises, is this pre-built going to save the day? Could you use this for any length of time to play games? Well, let's find out. The main reason you'd even come to buying the system is for its CPU and graphics card. Honestly, if they're even half as good as what the box shows, then you'd be in for a treat at this price. Speaking of the specifications for those who care, the system comes with an AMD Ryzen 5 3500 CPU clocked at 3.6 GHz base, and it features a 4.1 GHz boost clock if you care about that. It features a single 8GB stick of 3200 MHz DDR4 RAM, a 256 GB Kioxia NVMe SSD, a GeForce GTX 1650 Super graphics card with 4 GB of GDDR6 video memory, as well as a what looks to be proprietary-ish 400-watt 80+ platinum power supply. Aside from the technical specs, the rest of the hardware is honestly subpar. The case is one of those mini tower OEM cases with little room to add larger graphics cards or storage devices outside of a single or two 3.5-inch hard drives, according to this picture. The power supply appears to be a non-standard affair. Maybe it follows ATX 12VO, but I cannot confirm nor deny. The GPU requires the use of one 6-pin PCIe power connector, so at least it has that going for it. The power supply supports a card with an 8-pin power connector, which is nice for future-proofing. The CPU cooler looks cheap in nature, almost certainly fully aluminum with no copper plate, core, or heat pipes, but we'll explore that later. Unfortunately, the board is proprietary to this HP system, utilizing what is impressively AMD's X570 chipset with PCIe Gen 4 support. While the GPU is only Gen 3, that is pretty nice to have considering the CPU has PCIe Gen 4 support, though it is still lackluster regarding expansion. To summarize the rest of the system's ports, on the front you do have a headphone/headset combo jack, 4 USB 3.1 5GB per second ports, Type A of course, an SD card slot, and what I believe is a 5 gigabit per second USB Type-C port. On the rear of the machine, you don't have a lot accessible to you, but you do have audio jacks for line in and line out, 2 more USB 3 5 gigabit per second ports, and 2 USB 2 ports, presumably if you use the included keyboard and mouse. The motherboard does support video out should you have an APU installed, like a Ryzen 3 3200G or Ryzen 5 3400G, both of which are supported but not installed, so the outputs are naturally covered up with dummy plugs. The GPU does include 3 outputs, DVI, DisplayPort, and HDMI. And lastly, of course, is the power input. In addition to the Ethernet, the computer does come installed with a Wi-Fi 5 and Bluetooth card in the included mini PCIe slot. HP says this system is expandable, and likely what they mean is you can add additional storage via hard drive, more RAM, and maybe upgrade the SSD and graphics card. What the system does come with is fairly bare bones, and it is possible to add to what the system comes with in the future should the need arise, but I'll get to that later. For now, the last thing I need to point out for the sake of this review is I did install a 2TB hard drive into the hard drive slot inside of the case. There is an included SATA data and power cable for this purpose, so luckily the included screws make it easy to install a hard drive should the need arise. But other than that, I've not made any modifications to the system's hardware, specs, or otherwise, including thermal paste and other measures like that. But to try to rush this review into the gaming portion, since I'm sure that's what everybody's here for, let's dig right into it. Alright, time for the gaming portions. I tested a number of different games, both old and new, and games that would be either high frame rate, AAA, or perhaps could provide interesting test results, whether it be temperature related, the game adds stutters, or use all the system RAM, which isn't really that hard to do. This isn't an all-encompassing set of results, since I don't currently own any modern Call of Duty games, Assassin's Creed games, Battlefield, etc. And no, I don't play Fortnite before you ask, and neither do I have the internet to support downloading these games anyway. I barely have enough bandwidth to partake in a Discord voice chat, let alone watch YouTube in 720p and have anything else using the internet at the same time. So, please respect what I've tested today, and if you want a certain game tested that I don't test, then I can rest assure you that there's probably someone else on YouTube who has tested that game for you. Now, let's get with the results. Now I am going to run through these numbers quite quickly, so if I do miss some detail, that is, well, going to be probably explained later should it be necessary. Or if you have any further questions, be sure to let me know down below in the comment section. Starting off, we have Red Dead Redemption 2's benchmark test at 1080p resolution using Xbox One X equivalent settings from Digital Foundries. With these settings applied, this computer got 55.4 FPS on average, though there was a lot of noticeable stutter, most likely due to the machine only having not only 8GB of RAM in single channel, but it was likely running out of RAM, and since I have the machine configured to use the hard drive as a page file, it was likely chewing through that instead of the SSD, so that might explain where some of the unexplained stutters and, well, unexpected stutters for that matter came from. It wasn't micro-stuttery in the sense that it was unplayable, but it was definitely noticeable. Adding more RAM would fix this problem entirely. Next is Grand Theft Auto V, an older game but still very popular amongst people who play the online portion. At 1080p with most of the settings between high and very high, some set to very high like textures, but other mainly important settings are set to high with no MSAA. This scored 100 FPS on average during the benchmark test with a 1% low FPS rating of nice 0.2. This game really doesn't indicate any stutter, although it would still definitely be in your interest to give this machine dual channel memory. 8 gigs is fine, it is enough to run GTA 5 no problems as it was back in the day, but it is definitely hurting for memory performance. Although it is a little bit more CPU bound than anything, especially online, which is kind of surprising given that it is 6 physical cores, but there is no SMT, so that does definitely affect some of the performance. The next game I tested was Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p resolution with the medium preset. We did score an average of 70.3 FPS. With a 1% low of 32.2. This game is definitely pushing the 8GB of RAM in the system to the max, and it is definitely indicative of some actual stutters that cause gameplay, well, stutters. So, needless to say, the limited amount of RAM is affecting what this machine could probably do, although it is still GPU bound. A Hat in Time next at 1080p with the game's highest preset, very high quality. This game is indicative of some extra stutter because, well, it is kind of like Grand Theft Auto 4 in a sense that it does have some optimization problems. It does run a little bit better on NVIDIA cards like the 1650 Super in this case, so it is definitely possible to get high frame rates out of this game with an average of 149 FPS. Though, as mentioned before, again, this has problems with optimization. Memory speed could be problematic, especially since this is single channel, going back to that problem once again. So some stutter is definitely evident, and it also doesn't help that this game is on the hard drive, so that also helps with, streaming the files, and that causes a lot of stutters as well. Not unplayable, and especially if you're playing the game for a while, the stutters tend to go away, and it does smooth out performance noticeably so, and you'll have a great time playing this. The Long Dark next at 1080p Ultra with an average of 106 FPS. This game does tend to vary in its performance based on which systems you run it on and based on which graphics preset you use. But in this case, Ultra seems to run fine, and should you want more frame rate, you definitely can turn the preset down from Ultra since the visuals of the game don't really change all that much. It's mostly down to lighting and the flames and texture resolution, all that stuff, but generally speaking, this game has an artistic enough style to where running the game at a lower preset really doesn't affect the visuals all that much, and so you do get a drastic uplift in performance. Though it's not to say that if your machine is not really able to run the game to begin with, then you're not going to have that much capability of making it much better by reducing the quality settings or resolution or whatever have you. Still, in this case, this game runs great. And for those who like these sort of indie-style survival games, this will definitely be up your alley. It runs fantastic. Next up is Golf with Your Friends, a game I like to test because, number one, it runs on a wide variety of hardware, and number two, I have a bit of experience testing this game. And it still will give high frame rate experiences with the Ultra preset at 1080p. This game would be probably better suited to running with VSync at 4K, since this graphics card does support 4K 60Hz output, but that's up to you. But at least with the Ultra preset at 1080p with this map called The Escapists, you do get 296 FPS on average, and it is definitely a little bit on the stuttery side just due to the fact that it's, hurting for memory bandwidth. So, it's not going to notice itself that much just because the figures show it, so you're going to have a great time with this. However, with the Worms map, which is the most intensive inbuilt map in the game, you do get a noticeably lower average of 174.6 FPS. Now, of course, that's nothing to scoff at, it's still at least 144 FPS, but it is something to keep in mind that these figures in particular are a little bit more noticeably, like, I guess, worse. I mean, at least you don't have the hard stutters. I think that might have just been recorded because of Windows Update or something like that. You know how it goes. It was probably Patch Tuesday or something when I was recording these figures, so it is what it is. But in any case, Golf with Your Friends will give you a fantastic experience on the system. Next up is the Outer Worlds with the 1080p resolution and high preset as well, with an average FPS of 98.5. Now this game seems to favor Nvidia cards, even though I guess on the splash screen it says Ryzen and Radeon, which is kind of interesting, but I guess I don't have enough of a Radeon collection to actually see if it's good enough for Radeon cards. But in any case, with this setup, it does seem to run quite well, though it definitely is pushing both the CPU and the GPU, hence the hot temperatures, because I accidentally left the MSI Afterburner overlay on, so whoops. Now the CPU definitely doesn't run in the mid to high 80 degrees Celsius range all the time. That's just because it's using this CPU to record right now. Normally the CPU is either in the mid to high 70s and at worst low 80 degrees Celsius range. Flatout 4 Total Insanity is another game I tested because it is optimized for Nvidia cards, and in this case it definitely pushed the system quite a bit because the GPU started to thermal throttle at 83 degrees Celsius. But in any case, it did run well. I did this campaign where it had 4 different races in distinct different environments, and it averaged for all the races together about 117 FPS, with very little stutter to speak of. It actually ran really well, although again, I think it's probably hurting because of the memory bandwidth, so that's probably why it stutters a little bit, even though this game really doesn't need that much memory to run at all, but still. Possibly one of the most demanding games here today is Watch Dogs 2. I don't have Watch Dogs Legion currently, so you'll just have to bear with me. This is what I've got. But either way, it does push this system to its limits with an average FPS rating of 63. And there's definitely stutter. The system is trying to keep everything in RAM, and it's also trying to load from a hard drive, so that doesn't exactly help either. Going to the Ultra preset is not advised because it does use more than 4 gigabytes of VRAM at this resolution, so very high as high as it'll go. But this game does seem to run alright once every asset loads in that you'll need, and it's playable enough, I suppose, so moving on. Another game I like to test, even though it is from a smaller game developer, but it does run on such a wide margin of hardware, is called Distance. And I mean that this thing can run on a wide variety of hardware, since you can tune it to run on probably as low as a GeForce 8800 GT, although it won't look pretty, but it will run. But I digress. This computer at 1080p resolution with every single setting maxed out got an average of 93 FPS while starting to play through the first campaign in the game. So there are like 4 distinct campaigns, 3 of which you'll probably notice, but the 4th one is hidden unless you play through the rest of the game. Just a little bit of an Easter egg for you, just a little bit of a spoiler, if you will. But in any case, playing through the first campaign went very well, and the only times that it stuttered was when it was changing tracks or changing levels. Like at the end of each level, there's usually a effect that plays, and because of some bottleneck in the system, I'm not entirely sure if it's the hard drive or it's down to RAM, it does cause a micro stutter to occur, which does mean that the benchmark results get a little skewed. But trust me, you set VSync, you're good to go, no problems playing this game, although again, having dual channel memory does make a big difference. Another title I wanted to try, but I haven't ever tried until the review video of this machine, was Journey to the Savage Planet. A kind of an interesting exploration-based game where you are on an unknown planet and you have to explore resources. I haven't gotten too far into it myself, but I did try it on Game Pass once, and I did buy it for PC since I think it was interesting enough to try, particularly for benchmarks. At the high preset with 1080p resolution, it does get 93 FPS on average, rounding up, and it doesn't really have much stutter, at least after the initial loading times. Though there is some transition stutters between certain areas, so that is something to keep in mind, but otherwise it runs well, and I could see this being an enjoyable experience on this machine. Glossing over Grand Theft Auto 4 quickly enough here, at 1080p with most of the settings configured quite high except for night shadows at medium and draw distance and detail distance settings set to 69% out of 100%, nice. We do see an average of 105 FPS, but it is definitely still stuttering. That's just GTA 4 in a nutshell for you, but again, this is probably down to VSync and the hardware basically not being well optimized, since again, this game is from about 2009 or 2008 on PC, or whenever it was released, I don't remember. Either way, doesn't matter. It's been updated with the complete edition. It has seen a little bit of updates to fix performance problems and so on and so forth. So it does run better than it used to, but whatever. It doesn't matter too much. It does run well. Black Mesa is the last game that I'm including in these benchmark results, since it is a game that I've been wanting to test on the channel now, and this is the first system I'm using these results in. This machine ran it very well with 207 FPS on average, combined about half an hour of gameplay at least. And there's a little bit of stutter with the loading screens because, again, just like the original Half-Life, a lot of environments have to load, and they are highly detailed for what they are. And I did run this game at the highest in-game preset of just simply high at 1080p resolution. So if you do have a high refresh rate monitor, well, there you go. You can play this game at high refresh rate. It will look great. Though I think the single channel memory is causing some of the stutter alongside the hard drive, so it goes back to the same old broken record repeating myself over and over again sort of thing, where you might want to invest a little bit more money into the hardware, should you want to do that with this machine. And now it's time for the part of the video where I sort of take apart some of these things, because I want to get a better idea as to things like thermal paste quality and application quality, and overall take a deeper dive at some of the components, like the heatsink for the CPU and the GPU, well, generally speaking, the motherboard as well, and some other aspects. Now, I'm also taking this excuse to repaste the CPU and the GPU because, well, let's face it, I'm sure the thermal paste is not nearly as good, and you'll probably soon see what I'm talking about. But first things first, without further rambling, let's take the graphics card out. Now, I don't know if we're going to have to take this metal plate out, but what I'm thinking is we should just be able to press that lever there. And yes, the GPU will come out with a little bit of persuasion. So, why don't we take a look at that first? So this is a GTX 1650 Super from HP, and so far first impressions are it's better than Dell in a sense, and we'll get to what I mean in a moment. But this card is not the most impressive. It just strictly uses what looks like an aluminum heatsink, a singular fan, and it does have openings to allow the air to go through, unlike Dell's, which basically covers up that portion of heatsink with a GeForce GTX logo and the rest of the fan shroud. But otherwise, it's very much giving me Dell OEM vibes with this thing. There's no obvious thermal pads on the GDDR6 VRAM, so that's a red flag. And on top of that, it just appears like the only thing holding this cooler on is 4 screws. And of course, the rest of the shroud is probably held on with like 2 other screws. Not a very high quality card. There's no extra cooling protection over all the other components. So needless to say, this is not a very expensive, ready to game on for long sessions card, if you know what I'm getting at. All right, so setting the computer itself off to the side here for a moment, let's check out what's underneath the heatsink of this GPU. I can't imagine that we're going to be expecting a whole heck of a lot. And hopefully in the process I don't manage to knock over my phone camera, because that would not make me real thrilled. And before anybody comes after me saying, oh no, you're avoiding your warranty, I don't really care. I'm an IT professional. I service computers day in and day out, both old and new. And I think I have a bit of an idea as to what I'm doing. So I don't need any kind of parental guidance from anyone who thinks that. Well, I called that one. Anyways, as I was saying, I don't really need parental guidance from anybody to tell me how to run a camera. I'm almost 22 years old. I think I have a bit of an idea. Wow, really, that was all that was holding this thing on was 4 screws. Jeez. And, yeah. I'm not sure what the sticky stuff is. I don't know if that's just leftover flux from when they were assembling the card or what the deal is, but you can clearly see it's just a plain Jane aluminum heatsink. The thermal paste did have kind of okay coverage around the edges, but definitely towards the middle it was doing a lackluster job of coverage, and the mounting pressure seems to favor the outside edges rather than having a central appearance. So perhaps maybe the thermal paste, if applied in a better way, could actually do a halfway decent job. But since again there's no copper cold plate or heat piping or anything on this heatsink, it's not going to do very good. And this is only a 1650 Super, mind you. So, I mean, that's another thing to keep in mind. It's probably not going to have the same thermal output as, say, a 1660 or a Super of that variant. But the point still stands. It's a very cheaply assembled card. There's not a lot of thermal protection over anything else on the card as well. So essentially, it's just taking the heat from the die and blowing it out the back and basically out the sides and the rear of the card. So I'll give this thing a leg up over Dell in that where the GeForce GTX branding is, they don't try to cover up that portion of the heatsink. So the airflow can actually escape out this side of the card, and it actually is somewhat covered on the bottom of the heatsink. And of course, I'm covering it with my hand here, but you do have a side exit as well as a front exhaust or whatever, as well as going out the back of the card for obvious reasons because there's a bunch of holes there. But to push this section of the video forward, not a very impressive card, very cheap to manufacture, of course, hence why this machine probably was built at the price point it was built at. Okay, apologies for the lighting in this section of the clip. We're going to move on to the CPU and get the heatsink off of that. Now, what I'm looking for is to see, okay, it does not look like there's any major wiring that is zip tied together over here, so we can just simply take off the heatsink. Oh. Well, yikes. It looks like I just took out the CPU from the socket as I was taking the heatsink out. Well, this just pretty much proves my point about the thermal paste being rough on the CPU. If it was that good enough to basically rip it out of the socket. Well, I guess that's one thing. Okay, let me grab a flathead screwdriver here and let me see if I can gently coax off the CPU, because I definitely don't want to be intentionally trying to bend any of the pins, which luckily I didn't by ripping it out of the socket, so. But it looks like, all things considered, they did get an even amount of coverage on the IHS of the CPU. But my big concern is you can see some of the cracks that have formed. I think the coverage probably focused somewhere around in this area of the chip, which probably explains why under a moderate load on the CPU, it was running very hot anyway, especially the more performance-oriented cores. And so that probably explains it. And I've also found that this thermal paste is incredibly gooey, which is good for thermal transfer in a sense, but it also makes me worry that when it ages, it's going to turn to like solid clay. Ugh, not a very nice thermal paste solution. And then also, leading into the heatsink, the coverage on the heatsink wasn't very good. At least most of the thermal paste ripped off of the CPU. So I wonder if that was a result of the chip running at like 80-something degrees for basically every game I was playing. I'm not entirely sure if that was a byproduct of it, but needless to say, the CPU's thermal paste quality, or whatever they used for thermal paste, is basically the usual crap, which is crap. Definitely going to repaste this thing, but it also reaffirms my point that the heatsink has no copper core or cold plate or anything like that. It's just straight aluminum. And for this kind of a chip, since it is 65 watts, this is about the limit, I would assume. It barely keeps the thing under reasonable temperatures under load. And so I wouldn't expect that for long-term usage, it's very high quality. I mean, it'll definitely do the job, just not fantastically. I'll repaste the CPU here soon. I did repaste the GPU. But taking a look inside of the rest of the case, you can see there's the AM4 socket. And I just wanted to look at the back plane. I'm not sure if this system strictly has the back plate on the motherboard, or if it's like Dell and it mounts directly to the case. Either way, you can tell, I think, yeah, it looks like it might actually go through the case. So it's maybe one of those proprietary affairs like Dell, which is unfortunate because HP's claim to upgradability is meaning you're stuck with this motherboard. And also this is reaffirmed by the fact that obviously this front panel I/O here is definitely part of this motherboard, as you might be able to blurrily see here with my phone's digital zoom. The I/O of this motherboard
definitely is part of this motherboard. There's no separate PCB, there's no front panel headers. The power button is part of this board. There you can see the Wi-Fi card as well as the CPU power. And the SATA power is off the motherboard as part of the presumably ATX 12VO spec, and the SATA port's there. There's also a missing header for the hard drive LED. This is not equipped with that. There you can see power switch wiring there from the power supply. There is a secondary SATA power, so presumably you could put dual SATA SSDs in this thing. Well, whether you'd want to or not is another thing entirely. There you can see the SSD once again, and there's only 2 PCI Express expansion slots. However, I think that's probably for the better. It probably allows for better airflow that way, so you're not trying to shove something in the 4th PCI Express slot, which could be pretty bad. And obviously, there's an X1 and an X16 slot. Now, since this motherboard presumably uses X570, although I highly doubt it based on that heatsink down there, I would assume that it does have Gen 4 capability through the X16 slot, though I don't have a PCI Express Gen 4 graphics card to test with, being an RTX 3000 series or an AMD RX 5000 series, like a 5700 XT or a 6800 XT or something like that. I don't have anything of nature to test that with, and probably for obvious reasons I'm not going to, in a system like this anyway. There's also no cooling over these voltage regulators and whatever. So, yeah, it's definitely not a very high-quality X570 motherboard, if I should say so myself. Actually, come to think of it, no, this is the 4-pin CPU power. This is probably some other power that's coming from the power supply to the motherboard from the power supply itself. And the power supply itself is one of those weirdly non-standard form factor power supplies as well, although it is 80+ platinum. God dang it, people. Excuse the background noise. Our neighbors are total retards and stupid, so don't mind them. Anyways, this is probably not ATX 12VO in a standard sense, although it is definitely 80+ platinum certified according to this label here. And it is rated for 400 watts combined total output. So, generally speaking with these OEM computers, they do a pretty good job on their power supply quality. They're usually farmed out to some other manufacturer, but generally speaking, they're of a pretty good quality. And I'm not entirely sure. It's a light-on power supply. Okay, so that answers my question there. So I'm sure this power supply is totally fine. It's probably going to last probably longer than the computer itself. So at least it's got that going for it. But it does mean that you're left with no room for further expansion. There are these conspicuous holes here on the case, but I don't think they lead anywhere, because obviously there's no way for a standard power supply to fit in here. And it also does make me wonder if inside the case there may have been a different version of a machine that used the same case that had an internal speaker option. Alright, luckily I didn't kill the system by pulling the CPU out of the socket abruptly like that, so it's good. It still works.
So I could go into Cinebench scores and Geekbench scores, but those really don't make that much of a difference. So what do I ultimately think of this system? Well, the hardware is great enough for a pre-built, but I do think that the SSD is not big enough for a gaming computer. Honestly, 256 gigs is just not going to cut it for the kind of games that I'm sure people want to play with these computers. On top of that, future upgradability is a questionable affair considering the motherboard has limited CPU support as it is. And on top of that, the power supply is limiting. You only have 2 RAM slots. The motherboard's proprietary, and so on and so forth. I mean, I could go on all day about that sort of stuff. But ultimately, I don't think people really care too much. They just care about the computer itself inside of its own bubble. And for that, it does an alright job. Although I do think that it would be great to upgrade the RAM and SSD, or at least give it a hard drive for extra capacity if you do plan on using this for actual long-term usage or gaming, or whoever you intend to have this machine be used by. It may just be in your best interest to put a little bit more money into either this system itself or getting a higher tier model, or maybe going with another vendor. But at $600, it is hard to argue right now given the GPU shortage, so I guess it gets a just slightly above passing for me. But that's just because I worry about long-term value and upgradability and longevity and everything like that. But with that having been said, what do you think about this system? Let me know down below in the comments section. If you like what you saw, you know what to press. If you didn't like it as much, well, then you also know what to press. Get subscribed by clicking subscribe down below, and click the bell so you don't miss when I upload new videos. And with that having been said, thank you all very much for coming to watch, and I'll catch you all in the next one.